tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show.
We are going to talk a little bit about the cabinet changes we saw today, but I want to focus on the bigger picture, which is that it's easy to look at the list of ministers and say, oh, well, Bill Blair went to defense, and this guy went to emergency preparedness, and Anita Anand went from defense to Treasury Board, and all of these things, but it's less easy to look at this and say that none of it really matters, that this is not actually an issue that will change anything materially about the function or lack of functionality in this government. Now, what was interesting here is that it wasn't just about the shuffling of the deck chairs on the Titanic, so to speak. There were some pretty key promotions, some rookies. It's now a backbencher, Arif Virani, that went up to be the Minister of Justice, and then you had some pretty senior people who have been Trudeau loyalists for their time in cabinet that are now finding themselves relegated to the backbenches. And some of those did the whole face-saving exercise yesterday of saying, oh, it's because I'm not running again. That was Omar Algabra's line. But some of them have not actually said whether they're running again. So Marco Mendicino, assuming he manages to find his way back to his office, which I think is a stroke of luck every day if he does, he hasn't actually done the whole I'm not running again thing. He just gave this statement this morning in which he talked about how grateful he was and how proud he was and how great Justin Trudeau is and how he did so much good stuff in cabinet. And there we have the letter there. If you haven't read through it all and you can't see it and you can't read it, don't worry, neither can Marco. But the thing about it that I would point out is that it's like the guy was fired and he's somehow been head-faked into writing this letter about just how great it was and how honored he was and all of that, when he was the biggest embarrassment in the Trudeau cabinet. Aaron Wudrick joins us now. He is the guru on all things domestic policy at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Now, that's not actually how it's listed on his resume, at least not last time I checked. Aaron, good to talk to you as always. Thanks for coming on today.
Always great to be here, Andrew.
I mean, look, you've been around politics for a while. You know the game here. What are the reasons for a shuffle of this magnitude?
Well, especially what I call late stage government, any government that's getting into second term or later, they need to put on a fresh face just because people are kind of getting sick and tired of them. They want to present themselves as being able to, reform themselves, right? When the public, you saw polls today, there's a huge appetite for change, right? And this happens, to every government after a certain amount of time, although I'd argue this government's certainly speeding up the process more than other ones do. So by presenting new people in cabinet, you can sort of at least superficially make the argument that, we're technically a new government. We have different people in charge. But as I think, Pierre Poilievre just pointed out, really in our system of government, it's the prime minister that matters. People associate the prime minister. He makes all the calls at the end of the day. He's the one who picks all of the cabinet, handpicks them. So unless the prime minister is actually being changed, it's really hard to make the case that you've got a completely new government.
Yeah, and you're right when you talk about the longevity of a government. I mean, Stephen Harper ran into this when he was running in 2015. When you've been there for, at that time, 9 years, you don't really have much of an excuse for not having done something. I mean, theoretically, you may be responding to a new challenge that's popped up, and Harper had the refugee crisis, national security, stuff like that. But it's a lot easier to be in opposition when you can look at the government and say they're doing this wrong, this wrong, this wrong, this wrong. When you're a guy like now Justin Trudeau, who's been there for 8 years, potentially 10 years by the time the next election rolls around, it's very difficult for him to convincingly tell people he's going to do something when he's had, at that point, a decade in which he could have and should have done whatever that thing is.
Sure. And look, part of politics is just gravity. Right. I mean, you're there for a long time. You pile up a lot of baggage. And I've been a big critic of many things this government's done. But part of it is sort of the death of a thousand cuts. Right. It just builds up over time. And so governments, they see cabinet shuffles as a way to try and, again, I say superficially because, frankly, I don't think they matter very much. I mean, I was remarking to someone that, can anybody point to me historically a cabinet shuffle that really changed the game, that had a government that was tired and unpopular, and they shuffled some ministers and suddenly their fortunes reverse? I mean, it just doesn't happen. And part of that is because, folks like you and me and folks tuning in, we're the weirdos. We pay a lot of attention to politics. A lot of Canadians don't. They got busy lives. They could not pick out any of these people out of a police lineup. Maybe Chrystia Freeland, but the vast majority of these people, they just don't know who they are. And so I don't think it really helps Justin Trudeau's fortunes when he changes them.
Yeah, and I would say generally are probably better off not needing to know, because the more you learn about politics, the less sane and less convivial you are, in my experience on these things. So I'll ask then about it in a bit of a different approach, because, we may see at some point in the next couple of weeks mandate letters for these ministers, but are we expecting anything resembling a change in policy to go along with this? Because if we are just, changing around the faces, but you're actually making no change to your overall agenda, it's really not that convincing a fresh face, as you would put it earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's more important is going to be mandate letters, because that signals what the prime minister wants. And at the end of the day, especially under this prime minister, and I would argue under Stephen Harper as well, ministers are only going to be as effective as their boss lets them be. Mm-hmm. And so, it doesn't really matter how great you are. If Justin Trudeau puts you in a box and says you can only do these two things, you're kind of limited in what you're able to do. One thing I thought was interesting was the assignment of Sean Fraser to housing. So this is everybody knows housing is a very important file. I think it is going to be the main issue in the next election, if it isn't already. I think the Liberals are tuning into this late in the game. I think they realize that if they don't take some major action on this, Pierre Poilievre is going to eat their lunch on housing. So, Sean Fraser's, by all accounts, been a pretty strong performer in cabinet. He's generally well liked. So I think that giving him this portfolio is a sign that they're probably taking it more seriously.
Yeah, and I think that's actually an important point as well that should factor into people's analysis on this is, who the stronger communicators are when you're putting them on a certain file. And I mean, I was, making a few cracks at Pablo Rodriguez's expense, but this is not a guy who I'd say has been a particularly good messenger on Bill C-11 and Bill C-18. He has failed to understand, either by obstinance or just by not being particularly transparent, he's failed to understand what his bill does. He's flip-flopped on what it will do and all these internet regulations. And the fact that he's out of that file when the internet regulation file is still alive and well in Canada, I feel is actually quite noteworthy.
Yeah, look, communications are obviously important to every government, very important to this government. In many cases, I would argue that from this government's point of view, the communications are the deliverable. Actually following through and delivering what you promised doesn't matter. It's the press conference and the messaging that they value most, because that's where they get their political bang for the buck. And for Pablo Rodriguez, I mean, to be fair, there's only so much lipstick you can put on a pig, and Bill C-18 is a pretty big pig. And I don't know that there's any way to message that bill well, because it's a terrible bill that is doing a lot of damage to Canadian media. So, yes, I think there are other files on things like housing where, the Liberals are doing certain things. I don't think they're doing anywhere near enough on housing, but there are a few things they're doing that if they had better comms, they could probably get a little bit more credit for.
Now, you had pointed something out on Twitter earlier, which I found quite funny. It was, I don't know which TV network it was, but you were watching and they had this bold observation about the new cabinet that they might, focus on the economy now.
Yeah, they said, new cabinet to focus on economy. And I thought, well, what have they been doing for the last 8 years?
That's like a John Madden style, political commentary there. Of oh yeah, when the quarterback goes, that'll be a touchdown. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a little bit. It just makes you think. You've been there a long time. You would have thought they'd come around to the importance of the economy a little bit sooner than today.
Yeah, so let's just be a little bit more forward-looking here. And I know that neither of us has the crystal ball, but we've seen the poll numbers. I mean, Justin Trudeau can stand up there and talk about how everything is sunshine and roses. Chrystia Freeland can go out and talk about, actually, inflation is doing really well right now. But Canadians are clearly not buying it, at least not at this moment in time in the snapshot and sample that was captured by the latest polls. I mean, what would the turnaround be? If you were advising Trudeau, I mean, I might not have you on as much, but if you were, what would the message be on how to steer that ship in a better direction?
Boy, it's tough. It would require a dramatic break from the past, right? And this government has shown no capacity to do that. I mean, Justin Trudeau has been a prime minister who likes to spend in the bad times and spend in the good times and then spend some more for good measure. That's one problem. I mean, there's just a colossal amount of money that's been going out the door for what? I mean, spending is up something in the range of 30%. I don't think most Canadians believe they're getting 30% government services or have a 30% quicker commute or 30% better health care or any of these things. So I think there needs to be a big U-turn there. I think, the interesting thing to me was by even having this shovel, it signals to me that Justin Trudeau is definitely running in the next election, right? There's been a lot of talk about whether or not he's going to take a walk in the snow or I guess a walk in the sand because it's the summertime. I think the fact he had this shuffle suggests he's not going anywhere because why have this shuffle now? Why try and reset and retool now if he's even thinking remotely of leaving? He would have just let the cabinet sit as it is. So the fact he's done this tells me he's going to be prime minister when the next election is called, and it's going to be him versus Pierre Poilievre when the election goes.
Yeah, and I think you're right about that. And I think that it's not necessarily wise to go in and try to assess what Justin Trudeau's mindset is on a particular issue. But I do feel that putting Anita Anand, who was by all accounts actually quite a capable defense minister, in Treasury Board, which is certainly an important role to the functioning of government, but is a much less public-facing role, has been a bit interesting because she was one that has been wildly rumored to be a potential leadership contender and not really tarnished in the way that Chrystia Freeland are and some other folks are by the Trudeau brand. So the fact that she's now being taken out of this file, I actually think is quite interesting.
Yeah, one other observation I had of all the new faces that we see in cabinet, they're all relatively low profile folks, right? These are not the sort of high profile partisan attack dogs that folks will see on social media. I'm not going to name names, but people can probably guess the MPs that we're talking about. I was actually pleasantly surprised to see that those folks were not the ones who were promoted, right? Because there are some people who think that, being a sort of partisan clown on Twitter all day is sort of, doing a solid for the team, and that gets rewarded by putting these people in cabinet. But I think that would be a really perverse incentive. So I'm happy to see that for the new people they put in, these are relatively low-key MPs. They're not in there because they're like a big name or that they've been sort of lighting the world on fire or ticking people off or sort of provoking anger from their opponents. We'll see if these are folks that are just quietly competent and, agree or disagree with this government. Whoever's in charge on a given day, it's better that they be competent than not know what they're doing.
Yeah, fair enough. You're saying you didn't want Attorney General Mark Garretson, then I take.
I'm not going to name any names, Andrew. You may.
All right. Well, you're far more diplomatic than I am. Aaron Wudrick from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Always a pleasure, Aaron. Thanks for coming on today.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.